I am very happy to announce that Legend Onslaught is actually kinda hard. Today, I want to talk about the strategies and builds that I've used and seen used to increase your chances of success. This is advice specifically for Legend Onslaught, and more specifically for people just trying to get their first full clear for the emblem and whatever future adjustments Bungie might make to the activity in terms of loot incentives. I also skew a bit more heavily towards Midtown and Vostok advice because I thought Moth Yards was kind of boring, but there's also so much more space to play with in the Moth Yards. First, let's talk builds and class setup. I'm not going to be going over each build with significant detail. This is not a build video, and I'm under the impression that if you're trying to tackle Legend Onslaught, that you are familiar with builds in general and how to play one. If you're looking to take things as serious as possible to get your first clear, which you should, there is a very basic team composition that you should probably be running. Phoenix Protocol Warlock, Orpheus Rig Hunter, and some sort of self-sustaining Titan, whether that's Solar or Strand, if you're looking to keep things 1-1-1. If you wanted to drop Titan for another Warlock or Hunter, that would be fine as well. Orpheus Rig Hunter is a pretty boring setup. The entire build is based on getting as many Deadfall supers as possible to suppress enemy waves. But when I say that Orpheus Hunter is probably the most effective build in Onslaught, I really mean it. There have been times where I've been able to get 2 supers in the same wave of enemies. I've seen 3 supers in the same wave from a teammate. On Midtown and Vostok, enemies tend to spawn in 2 different spots, but they usually end up converging into one, which is the perfect place to plant your super. Well-placed supers will often get you back the majority of your super energy, if not restore it completely. You'll be popping out tons of orbs for your teammates as well, who can use those for their own supers or other effects. Move over International Women's Month because April's for the boys. That's right, it's National Testicular Cancer Awareness Month. Oh my god, okay, that's serious. This is serious time. This is serious time sponsored by Manscaped. One man every hour, every day is diagnosed with testicular cancer, with it being the most common form of cancer for males aged 15 to 35, which blew my mind because it's just something you would tend to associate with older individuals like 35 to 55. Manscaped has partnered up with the Testicular Cancer Society to make sure that you're taking care of yourself down there in more ways than one. Take care of yourself on the outside with the Lawnmower 5.0 Ultra. It's got the dual skin-safe blades for a clean cut. It's got the foil head attachment for a smooth finish. It's got the strong LED, and it's even got a cup holder, which I initially wrote as a joke, but now that I'm thinking about it, I'm kind of like, I mean, that's not a bad idea. And while you're taking care of yourself, head on over to manscaped.com/TCS to learn how to check yourself for testicular cancer. They even have their own app in case you need extra help with the instructions. Dudes, we all play with our balls every day of our lives, okay? They're like the original fidget spinner. Just now, maybe take 2 minutes while you're doing it and actually pay attention once a month. And as usual, you can use promo code Datto at manscaped.com to get 20% off and free shipping. That's code Datto at manscaped.com for 20% off and free shipping. Thank you very much to Manscaped for sponsoring this video. When I ran Orpheus, I ran with Buried Bloodline, which is the exotic from Warlord's Ruin. It may seem redundant to have multiple sources of Devour and Weakness, but it didn't stop me from running it with a large amount of success. Not only that, sidearms are the only weapon providing anti-barrier from the artifact as of this video, so it helps with dealing with champions too, and barriers appear in both variants of the mode. Special ammo is somewhat plentiful as well, so I was able to use it very frequently and at long ranges to take out any faraway enemies. Phoenix Protocol Warlock, while not anything flashy, is just as effective. Being able to have a safety zone in the majority of waves is a huge asset, especially for Tormentor or Demolitionists or Shriekers that might show up to ruin the party. However, I wouldn't opt for stacking too many wells, as you're going to want some offensive power at some point in the run. Cenotaph Warlock support can also be very good, supplying your team with tons of power ammo for the entire run. Although I will say that I didn't often run into power ammo problems as long as I paced myself. But there's nothing wrong with being able to spam it as much as you want. Other strong Warlock builds include Osmiomancy Warlock with Ager's Scepter for lots of freezing and crowd control capabilities, of which you will want in the later rounds, Osteostriga and Necrotic Grip Strand Warlock for tons of AoE damage and suspend effects, Briarbind's Warlock for constant uptime on Child of the Old Gods, and I'm sure many others that people will leave in the comments. Titans, I've run both Solar and Strand in this place with a good amount of success. The Solar Titan that I use is my Pyrogale build with Consecration. Excellent for big chunk damage on groups of enemies or harder hitting enemies, while also providing healing and radiant for yourself. The Strand Titan that I use is the typical Banner of War setup. 1-2 punch shotgun, a good primary, and tractor cannon. However, the deeper you go into Onslaught, the more you need to exercise caution, as Woven Mail and the Healing Pulse of Banner of War is not going to be able to save you all of the time, although the same can be said for any close range build. You can find both of those builds in the description. I've heard about people running Ward and Helm of Saint 14 to put a bubble on the ADU, but the issue is that you can no longer damage the enemies in the ADU area because there's a bubble, and they're still going to be doing damage to the ADU to some degree. It's much better to set up in a choke point, but even still, you can't shoot the enemies in a bubble unless you're in there with them. I've also found that a barricade at a choke point is more effective because you can just plant them more often than a Ward of Dawn. The issue with most Arc and Stasis setups is that they lack healing in the ways that Solar or even Void can sustain. Now, obviously, there are some exceptions, Arc Melee Hunter, Stasis Warlock, maybe Vesper Warlock, but if you're still struggling for your first clear, I would say besides Stasis Warlock, I would probably avoid playing Arc or Stasis for the most part until you get more familiar with Onslaught. Now, there's no specific reason that you need to limit yourself to that earlier full team composition, but it's a pretty balanced setup with good support capabilities, crowd control, and damage output, making only a small handful of waves actually difficult. There's very little downside to having a well and a tether for nearly every wave. In terms of weapons, I've actually been having more success with a hand cannon as my primary than I have an SMG. SMGs have not been feeling great to me in this mode, which does make a little bit of sense because things scale up pretty high. I've been rocking a Zowli's Bane from King's Fall a lot, and that's been cooking for me. Otherwise, pretty much any other workhorse weapons are gonna do well. Conditional Finality, still amazing. Chill Clip Fusions, Wave Frame Grenade Launchers, Sunshot, Buried Bloodline. A lot of people I know running double special again because of how much special ammo you can restore. Osteostriga, Ager's Scepter. I've seen Thorn for Unstop. Huckleberry making some appearances. The Lances, both Polaris and Graviton for the Moth-Yards. The list goes on. Just pick something good, you know, and you're chilling. This might sound insane to some people, but Indebted Kindness, the rocket sidearm from Warlord's Ruin, is actually very strong in this place for similar reasons to Buried Bloodline. It's got anti-barrier, it's got good range, it hits super hard. I've heard people using Forerunner as well. I also tried out Final Warning, and it's fine early, but I think it falls off a bit later. However, it was the first time that I used the weapon with any sort of seriousness. In terms of power weapons, I would be careful with swords in later stages. You're going to want some range. Machine guns are good. Dragon's Breath is amazing for both parts, waves and bosses. G-Horn, the same stuff that's been good. Shocker, it's still good. I am normally not a blinding grenade launcher guy, but I cannot deny that if there was a time where one would be hitting the most amount of targets possible, it's probably here. You sort of give up a hard-hitting special weapon in order to use it, so one person having one, I think, is going to be okay. Obviously, if you're a Witherhoard player, this place is probably your dream. Let's start with waves 1 through 10. These waves shouldn't be anything super difficult to deal with, but there tends to be one wave type that is much more lethal than the rest. For the Hive, this is the Night Wave. For For the Fallen, this is a Marauder or Giant Shank plus Explosive Shank wave. Knights hit incredibly hard from the get-go and are very tanky. Marauders are invisible, move fast, and hit super hard with their shotguns, and Explosive Shanks explode for very high damage, not to mention have some higher health Shanks spawning in as well, which will beeline for the ADU. Treat these waves in particular with respect, not only at the start, but for the entire run. It's very easy to get complacent when you're mowing down hundreds of enemies at a time. A Knight Sword to the face is going to humble you very quickly. While enemy spawns are random, what's not random is the order in which certain events happen. Augmented waves happen on waves 3 and 9 of a set. That's when something additional is happening in the wave. The ability to build is before waves 1, 4, and 7, and bonus objectives, which spawn a power ammo crate, can spawn on the 2s and or the 8s. I don't plan on really explaining the bonus objectives here because they're really straightforward. Just, do what they say, go fast, pick up the motes, shoot the things out of the air, cap the zone, etc. You're also going to have a champion spawn in on most waves at the very end of that wave. Hive needs Barrier and Unstop. Fallen needs Barrier and Overload. The only champion that I would say will give you major headaches are the Overload Captains, because they can deal serious damage to your ADU by themselves. Those need to be killed very fast. Unstop Ogres also hurt really badly, but they don't teleport once per second, Now, one of the best things you can do, much like with any difficult activity in the game, is learn the spawns of each map. There are only so many ways and directions that enemies will spawn in from, and they usually end up funneling into one area pretty heavily, with a secondary path a bit less taken. Knowing where these hotspots are and controlling them is probably about 80% of the experience, especially if you have a tether. Planting it in the hotspot is how you're going to generate most of your super energy in your run. If you watch a full run, which I suggest you do in order to get familiar, watch how players rotate and react to the spawns. You're going to see that there's only 3 major spawn zones for each ADU placement in most cases. Waves 1, 4, and 7 of each round tend to have easier to kill enemies in them in my experience, but it's definitely not all the time. And once you get late enough into the run, there isn't really an easy to kill enemy. Even enemies like Acolytes in the later stages are going to be very threatening. Otherwise, these starter waves should not be a big deal, and you should not need to spend any scrap here. I would advise holding on to as much scrap as possible for later rounds. A quick interjection on batteries. Even if your ADU is full health, you should be throwing your batteries all the time because they will give scrap as well. Batteries have pretty aggressive tracking, so you can throw them from far away. Just make sure you follow up if they bounce off of something, which is likely. You can also heal your upgrades with batteries by throwing the batteries at the upgrades. So you should always be trying to pick up as many batteries as possible, assuming you aren't putting yourself or your team in danger in order to do so. Also remember that after every 10 waves, when you come back after the boss, your ADU will be at full health. The first boss should also not really be that big of a deal to the point where you can just nuke it straight up. Remember that there are no locked loadouts, and you get a rally flag before the boss. So if you really want, you can set up multiple loadouts. One for waves and one for the boss. Don't be afraid in general to swap your loadout in the middle of a run. I know we've been conditioned to not being able to swap in endgame content, but you can here, and you should take advantage. These bosses pretty much all do the same thing, which is just walk around the area back and forth depending on how much health they have. The enemies in these rooms are probably some of the most lethal versions of these enemies that I've ever fought against. They respawn very often, and they are not to be disregarded in later stages. When it comes to boss damage, linears, rockets, your typical stuff is going to work here too. Dragon's Breath has been doing some work for me personally because it can hurt the boss and it can hit ads. Just remember that you aren't going to get access to power ammo besides random drops until you get a bonus objective after the boss. There are some additional mechanics in these boss rooms to make the fight easier. Stand in the zone, dunk the rift, kill the shielded dudes by getting the buff from standing in the zone. If it's possible to do these bonus things safely, you absolutely should, especially standing in the zone, because those turrets do some serious work on the boss when they spawn in. You can completely ignore these if you want though, and just focus on boss damage the entire time if you're set up for it. Waves 11 through 20 should pretty much be more of the same. I continue to not spend scrap here. At the most, I will do a level 1 decoy if we haven't gotten a tormentor yet. Otherwise, should just be business as usual, killing enemies, throwing batteries, you get it. Waves 21 through 30 is where things start to dial up a bit. I try to save all of my scrap for 30 and beyond, but if we still haven't gotten a tormentor yet, then I will buy a level 1 decoy at a minimum. It is not the worst idea to do a little bit of spending here, and honestly, if you can have a tier 3 decoy in every set of 10 waves from here on out, that is not a bad idea. Waves 31 to 40, I do a little bit more investing into some upgrades pretty much no matter what the situation is. Tier 1 or Tier 2 decoy, depending on what augments I've seen so far. Tier 2 turret, if there's a turret with good positioning that can hit everything. I don't really buy trip mines unless everything else is purchased or it's in a bad spot. Waves 41 to 50, spend everything. Tier 3 decoy if you're not on the moth yards. 2 if possible, or if they're nicely positioned. A tier 3 turret is nice as well, especially if it's in a defensive location. I would probably go more turret heavy on the moth yards as well, since there's so much empty space. Again, I ignore trip mines unless I have everything else that I want. I know they're cheap to buy and cheap to upgrade, but they have rarely felt worth it to me unless you get that perfect setup where you can kite a tormentor or a demolitionist into one of those things for some big chunk damage. Remember, this is an end game activity and it needs to be treated as such. Wave 41 to 50 has some of the strongest enemies in the game, 30 levels above you, which is higher than Grandmaster Nightfalls. Dinky enemies like Thrall, Acolytes, Dregs, and others will have no problem lighting you up if you're out of position or you don't have help. It's happened to me, it'll happen to you. Starting at wave 21 is also where the augmented waves can start to actually become a problem. So let's talk about these and how I handle them. Note that there does not appear to be any kind of a pattern when it comes to augmented waves, other than you won't see the same augment within the next 20 or so waves. Some augments will only show up one time, but it's pretty random as to which, and just because you got an augment early does not guarantee that you will see it again later. We'll start with the easier augments and then go towards the more difficult. One of the easiest to comprehend and usually deal with are the regular sky bombers. These will be 3 enemies, either knights or captains, that are highlighted on your map and that drop a bunch of damage on the ADU every so often. They will not aggro you until you engage with them, but they will always be dropping stuff on the ADU. In earlier rounds, 1 or 2 people can handle these guys pretty easily. They don't do anything special other than their regular attacks. But in later rounds, you should exercise a bit more caution because they're just naturally going to hit harder because of the scaling of the activity. You should handle these guys as fast as possible. Ideally, one of them dies immediately, but it's not the end of the world if they don't all die within the first 5 seconds. Next up are the spike mines. This is where you need to dismantle 2 mines that are guarded by either Briggs or Ogres. If you don't dismantle them, you instantly wipe, but the game gives you 90 seconds to do it. If you have an Invis Hunter, it's probably for the best to send them out to handle the mines because you capture the zone really quickly. Even a Titan Barricade will buy you enough time to do it. Hunters, just be aware that even though you're invisible, you might still get hit by the Brig. In earlier stages, you're very capable of outright killing the enemy guarding the zone, but in later stages, it's going to be a lot tougher. But the timer doesn't change. It's the same duration to dismantle it. You also have more time than you think. It's 90 seconds before you wipe. So you can spend the first half just slaying out and then go handle the mines. This one isn't too tough, but a death here means that no one's coming to get you for a little while. You're only going to die to the spike mines if you're just not really paying attention or something else goes horribly, horribly wrong. Next up are the shielded demolitionists. 3 enemies will spawn in with shields that can only be removed if you have the shield removal buff. There's a zone that's put on the ground that buffs you, and you use that buff to remove the shields. Standard stuff here. Because this shield removal can go quickly, I think it's for the best to immediately deal with these targets. Not only that, but if you let them regen their shields, having to hop back into the zone to get the buff can prove difficult in the middle of a round versus at the very beginning. If you have a Well of Radiance, drop it in the buff zone and just kill them as fast as possible. Next, we have the Shielded Sky Bomber, and this one tends to throw people for a loop. For the Hive, it's a giant ogre. For the Fallen, it's a brig. In earlier stages, you can probably send one person to mess around with the Sky Bomber, but they're pretty tough to kill solo, and they're still going to keep attacking the ADU. What I recommend doing is, in earlier stages, sending 2 people to just deal with it completely, unless it's a tougher wave of enemies, in which case, just ignore it and deal with the adds. And then in later stages, ignore it completely and deal with the enemies first. The enemies are going to be able to cook the ADU much faster than the Sky Bomber, and in my opinion, it is not even worth engaging the Sky Bomber until all of the other enemies are dead. You'll also have batteries dropping to help repair the ADU while you're dealing with the wave of enemies. The Sky Bomber is not going to destroy the ADU in one blast. It's going to take a little while, so as long as you're healing it to counter, you should be fine. The 2 toughest augments are the Tormentor and the Demolitionists, at least on Midtown and Vostok. However, in later rounds, I've struggled more with demos than Tormentors for reasons I'll discuss in a moment. Something that's going to apply to both Tormentors and Demolitionists is that if you do have a Well of Radiance or some sort of safety position, be careful setting up near the ADU. If you aggro any one of those bosses over to you and you're set up on the ADU, they're going to destroy both you and the ADU. This is mainly a Midtown problem, but it can happen anywhere. For the Tormentor, and for the demos too if you can make it work, decoys are your friend. From wave 31 onward, you should have a tier 2 decoy around at a bare minimum. Decoys tank an incredible amount of damage and are pretty good at getting the attention of enemies. By dragging a Tormentor over to a decoy or getting it to aggro the decoy, it's probably going to attack the decoy, and then you can lay into it. I would even recommend a Divinity hot swap, literally right in the middle of the round, if you feel like you need it. But your priority with the Tormentor needs to be, get it away from the ADU. Even if you need to have someone kite it around the whole time, the other 2 people can most likely handle the rest of the enemies, unless it's one of the more lethal waves, in which case it'll be a little bit tougher. You sort of need to play it by ear. Is the Tormentor locked onto the decoy and you have an easy group of enemies? Well, then you can probably focus on the Tormentor immediately, especially if you have a tether. Do you not have a decoy up for some reason? Well, then you need to kite. Do you have a harder group of enemies? Well, I hope you have crowd control. I also probably wouldn't break the shoulders of the Tormentor if you're not ready to commit to killing it. I know that the purple disc that they throw in the air is super annoying. First of all, shoot the purple disc. But the main threat of a Tormentor is their speed and ability to suppress and basically one-shot melee you. You can hide from the void attack from that floating disc at the least. For the Demolitionists, it's all hands on deck. In the earlier stages, these guys are total pushovers. You know, pop a couple of supers, throw some power ammo at them, they're going to go down easy enough. But in later stages, I think can be more threatening than a Tormentor, depending on your situation. This is because there are 2 of them, they have tons of health, they deal tons of damage, they spawn right next to the ADU, so they need to be addressed immediately, and they also don't really care that much about decoys. Tormentors are tough to take down, but Tormentors tend to want to chase down a specific target and can have their attention grabbed at some point by a decoy or by another player, whereas every time I've dealt with demos, they just kind of do their own thing. The issue with demos isn't really even the demos sometimes, it's that they exist and all of the other enemies are spawning in too. Sometimes you get lucky and you get an easy wave in an easy location. Sometimes you get the troll respawning shriekers in the smallest area of the map and the demos are right on top of the ADU. You're just at the mercy of whatever the game decides to throw at you, and sometimes it's just stacked against you. Well of Radiance is obviously huge here. It's what's going to keep you alive in the mayhem. Otherwise, burn everything you have here. You can try dealing with ads first to a degree, but I think the demos are going to cook your ADU way too hard to do anything about it if you try to deal with ads first. That is all of my advice for Legend Onslaught. It is much tougher than I originally thought it was going to be, so shout out to Bungie for making something more difficult than I was anticipating. As always, there are probably small bits of info or build suggestions or weapon suggestions that I have left out, can't cover it all, so drop your other bits of advice in the comments for your peers, and best of luck doing Legend Onslaught. Thank you all very much for watching. I will see you next time.